What if the most important moments in human history are not marked by beginnings, but by disappearances? Not the kind announced by fire, collapse, or conquest, but the quieter kind, where a civilization simply stops speaking and the silence stretches so long that later generations mistake it for emptiness. There are places on this planet where cities once breathed with human rhythm, where systems of knowledge were refined patiently across centuries, and then the thread was cut. No final inscription, no warning carved in stone, only absence spreading outward like fog, and, before you allow your body to sink completely into this calm, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if there is something in what I am whispering that makes you want to stay a little longer. If you wish, you may share the place and time where you are listening. I'm always curious about the small points of a light drifting quietly together through the night. History tells us that civilizations rise, flourish, and fall. It sounds orderly, almost comforting. Yet when the endings are examined closely, they feel strangely similar. Not chaotic, but patterned. Advanced societies across different continents, separated by oceans and millennia, appear to reach a moment where progress halts abruptly. Tools become cruder. Writing systems vanish. Architectural precision collapses into imitation. It is not merely decline, it is disconnection. In the ruins of once complex cultures, archaeologists often find something unsettling, evidence of sophistication followed by an inexplicable gap. Layers where craftsmanship regresses instead of improves. Cities abandoned without signs of invasion. Knowledge that does not evolve, but disappears entirely, as though erased rather than forgotten. These gaps are usually explained away with familiar words: collapse, drought, invasion, plague. Yet the explanations feel thin when the same pattern repeats again and again. Consider how often advanced infrastructure seems to arrive too early in the timeline. Drainage systems that should not exist yet. Precise stonework that modern tools still struggle to replicate. Calendrical knowledge that implies long-term astronomical observation, only to vanish from the cultural memory that follows. What becomes unsettling is not that these things existed, but that the societies capable of producing them did not pass them on. Civilizations are supposed to build upward, like sediment, each generation standing on the shoulders of the last. But what we see, repeatedly, is interruption, as if the ladder itself were removed. In Mesopotamia, the earlier cities appear suddenly, already complex, already structured. Writing systems emerge fully formed, not tentative. Legal codes arrive without drafts. And then, just as strangely, entire traditions dissolve. Centuries later, people occupy the same land with no apparent memory of what stood before them. The continuity we expected missing. Across the ocean, similar absences echo. In the Americas, monumental construction reaches astonishing scale and precision, then stops. Populations disperse. Knowledge fragments. Successor cultures inherit the stones but not the instructions. They reuse, revere, and mythologize what they can no longer replicate. What is rarely asked is why the endings feel coordinated, not in time, but in structure. Why progress peaks, then collapses into simplicity. Why advanced systems vanish wholesale instead of degrading gradually. Why writing disappears entirely in some regions rather than evolving. One possibility is natural catastrophe. Earth is not a gentle archivist. Climate shifts, volcanic winters, and cosmic impacts are known to reset ecosystems. Ice cores and sediment layers tell us that the planet moves through violent rhythms indifferent to human ambition, yet even catastrophe struggles to explain the selective nature of the losses. Why knowledge disappears faster than people? Why survivors rebuild simpler worlds rather than restoring what was lost? Another possibility lies not in nature, but in memory. Civilizations do not only fall physically, they fracture psychologically. When societies endure trauma beyond comprehension, continuity can break. Knowledge may be deliberately abandoned, associated with danger or hubris. Stories survive, but instructions do not. Symbols endure, but meanings fade. Still, there is something else that unsettles researchers who linger too long in these gaps. The sense that history has been smoothed, that the official timelines prefer clean arcs over interruptions, that discontinuities are treated as inconveniences rather than clues. Entire dark ages are compressed into footnotes. Thousands of years vanish between chapters with little curiosity about what was lost within them. Institutions that preserve knowledge also decide what counts as knowledge. Monasteries, empires, libraries, and later, academic systems act as filters. They transmit what aligns with prevailing structures and quietly discard what does not. Over centuries, this selective memory hardens into certainty. What remains is called history. What is missing becomes myth. Yet myths are stubborn things. Flood stories appear across cultures that never met. Tales of earlier ages, greater beings, and forgotten wisdom persist even when dismissed. They are often treated as allegory, but allegory itself may be a survival strategy, a way to carry dangerous truths through time without naming them directly. The uncomfortable question begins to form here, not loudly, but patiently. What if advanced civilizations do not disappear randomly? What if there is a recurring threshold, ecological, technological, or social, beyond which systems become unstable? What if progress contains its own erasure mechanism? And deeper still, what if some of these erasures are not entirely accidental? Power consolidates most easily when memory fragments. Control strengthens when comparison is impossible. A society that believes itself to be the first is easier to guide than one that knows it is merely the latest. None of this requires secret cabals or singular villains. Systems themselves behave this way. Empires rewrite, religions canonize, knowledge becomes doctrine, then dogma. Over time, curiosity narrows, questions become dangerous, gaps are patched over with certainty. What remains for us now is a landscape filled with ruins and silences, a planet that has hosted brilliance more than once, and just as quietly swallowed it. We stand surrounded by evidence that something has happened before, something we only half remember. As this first thread settles into place, another begins to pull at it. If civilizations keep disappearing in the same way, if progress keeps ending in erasure rather than inheritance, then the question shifts. Not toward the past alone, but toward the present moment. Are we different, or simply unaware of where the threshold lies? There are cities that did not fall. They were not burned, they were not conquered, they were not buried beneath layers of war or marked by mass graves. They were simply left behind. Streets emptied, workshops abandoned mid-task, wells still usable, walls still standing. And yet, the people vanished. Archaeology struggles most with silence. Destruction leaves signatures, carbon, fracture, trauma. Abandonment leaves questions. In many ancient urban centres, the evidence points not to catastrophe, but to withdrawal. A slow, deliberate stepping away from complexity, as though something essential had been broken long before the final departure. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa display an unsettling calm at the moment of their disappearance. No clear signs of invasion, no layers of widespread violence. Urban planning that rivaled or surpassed contemporaries, followed by fragmentation. Brick standards abandoned, drainage systems neglected, writing systems fading into illegibility. It is not that the people died out, they continued, but something in the structure of their civilization dissolved. Across the ocean, the same unease appears. In the Maya lowlands, great ceremonial centres were abandoned one by one. Stele inscriptions, once meticulously dated, stop abruptly. The calendar does not end. It goes quiet. Forests reclaim plazas. The population disperses into smaller settlements. Survivors remember the cities as sacred places, but no longer as living systems. The knowledge to sustain them does not transfer. Mainstream explanations lean toward drought, overpopulation, soil exhaustion. Each factor likely played a role, yet none fully explains why abandonment occurred unevenly, why some cities were left while others lingered briefly, or why recovery never reached previous complexity. Environmental stress can wound a society, but it does not automatically erase its memory. What is striking is how often abandonment coincides with the loss of specialized knowledge. Once a city is no longer maintained, certain skills decay rapidly. Astronomical observation, advanced engineering, record keeping, these require continuity. Interrupt that continuity, and knowledge collapses inward, not outward. It does not diffuse, it disappears. In several regions, successor populations reuse ancient spaces without understanding them. They occupy monumental architecture as shelters. They quarry old stone for simpler structures. The past becomes a resource, not a blueprint. This is not ignorance. It is inheritance without instruction. Why would people leave cities that still functioned? One possibility is that the cities themselves became dangerous. Complex systems amplify fragility. When trade networks fracture, when water management fails intermittently, when governance becomes brittle, urban life turns precarious. At a certain point, dispersal may feel safer than repair. But this explanation leaves a residue of discomfort, because abandonment is rarely total. People do not simply walk away from everything they know unless something deeper has shifted, a loss of trust in the system itself. Civilizations are agreements, shared belief in order, in meaning, in future. When that belief fractures, infrastructure follows. Temples lose authority, calendars lose relevance, writing ceases to feel necessary. Not because people forget how, but because they no longer believe the system is worth maintaining. There is also the question of timing. In several cases, abandonment appears staggered, almost synchronized across wide regions, not simultaneous but echoing, as if information traveled faster than armies, as if the idea of leaving spread. This is where the pattern begins to whisper. Advanced civilizations do not always collapse under force. Sometimes they withdraw from themselves. Complexity recedes. Networks simplify. Knowledge becomes localized, oral, adaptive. What follows is not extinction, but reset. And resets leave a peculiar archaeological signature. Regression without rupture. A step backward that looks intentional, even if it was not planned. Later cultures inherit the land, but not the mindset. They look at the ruins with awe, not continuity. They tell stories of ancestors who were greater, closer to gods, or more aligned with the cosmos. Myth fills the vacuum left by lost instruction. These myths are often dismissed as exaggeration. Yet they may encode something more precise. The memory of a time when life was structured differently, when knowledge was centralized and dangerous, when cities reached beyond a threshold that could not be sustained. What is rarely discussed is how often these abandoned cities were tied to systems of measurement. Time, water, stars. Calendars end. Astronomical alignments cease. Observatories fall silent. It is as though the act of measuring the world itself was interrupted. Measurement is power. It allows prediction, control, long-term planning. A civilization that loses its ability or desire to measure reverts to immediacy. Survival replaces projection. The future shortens. One begins to wonder whether abandonment is not merely a response to failure, but a survival strategy, a way to shed complexity before it becomes fatal, a way to step away from something that has begun to destabilize reality at a human scale. And yet, the cost is always the same. Once the thread is cut, it cannot be easily rejoined. Knowledge that took centuries to refine cannot be recovered by imitation. It must be rediscovered, often painfully, often incompletely. As these silent cities recede into forest, sand, or memory, another question presses closer. If abandonment is part of the pattern, then what happens to the knowledge that does not disperse with the people? Where does it go? Does it vanish entirely, or is it carried elsewhere, hidden, transformed? Because in some cases something survives, not openly, not institutionally, but quietly, fragmented, encoded. And if that is true, then the disappearance of civilizations may not be as complete as it appears. It may simply change form. What disappears first is rarely the people. It is the memory of how things were done. Tools can be copied, stones can be reused, but systems, the invisible agreements that make complexity possible, unravel quickly when continuity breaks. And among those systems, writing is often the first to fall silent. Across multiple civilizations, scripts vanish not gradually, but abruptly, not evolving into new forms, but stopping altogether. Clay tablets cease, inscriptions end mid-century. Symbols that once governed trade, law, astronomy, and ritual become undecipherable marks to those who come after. The loss is not just linguistic, it is structural. Writing is not merely a record, it is an operating system. When it fails, the civilization begins to think in shorter horizons. This pattern appears with unsettling consistency. A culture develops a writing system capable of abstraction, administration, and long-term planning. It uses symbols to stabilize memory beyond the human lifespan. Then something interrupts the chain. The next generation does not modify the script, it abandons it. Centuries later, people live among the remnants with no idea how to read the words carved into their own foundations. Why would a society give up writing? The usual explanations are practical. Literacy declines, elites collapse, education systems fail. But these explanations do not fully address the scale of the disappearance. Writing is too useful to vanish accidentally. Even in chaos, people cling to tools that preserve advantage. Unless the tool itself becomes associated with danger, writing centralizes power. It allows taxation, law, prediction, and control across distance and time. It enables the storage of obligations that cannot be argued with. In periods of extreme stress, writing may become a symbol of the system that failed, or worse, the system that caused the failure. When continuity breaks, oral tradition returns not as a lesser substitute, but as a more resilient form. Stories adapt, memory becomes local, knowledge is embodied rather than archived. This shift is often framed as regression, but it may be a form of triage. The disappearance of writing often coincides with the loss of standardized measurement. Weights, lengths, calendars, and accounting systems fragment. Time itself becomes uneven. Without shared measurement, large-scale coordination becomes impossible. Empires dissolve into regions, regions into villages, villages into kinship. Yet what lingers beneath this practical explanation is a deeper unease. Because writing does not simply record knowledge, it freezes it. And frozen knowledge can become brittle. When conditions change too quickly, rigid systems break rather than bend. Some scholars have noted that in several ancient collapses, the most abstract forms of knowledge vanish first. Advanced mathematics, astronomy, legal codification. What remains is practical survival knowledge. Farming, hunting, local medicine. The sky is still watched, but not measured. The past is still remembered, but not dated. It is as though civilizations shed their longest memories first. This raises an unsettling possibility. That advanced knowledge may be inherently unstable across generations unless supported by robust social frameworks. And when those frameworks fracture, the knowledge does not degrade, it evaporates. There is also the question of intentional forgetting. In some cultures, later traditions speak of forbidden knowledge, of wisdom that angered the gods, of ages destroyed because humans knew too much. These stories are often dismissed as moral allegory, but allegory can also function as warning. Knowledge shapes behaviour. A civilization that understands long cycles of climate, stars, or resources plans differently than one that does not. If such planning leads repeatedly to overreach, then forgetting may become adaptive. Consider how often writing systems are tied to elite control, priestly classes, bureaucratic castes. When these groups collapse, their tools are sometimes rejected by the wider population. Not out of ignorance, but out of association. Writing becomes a symbol of exploitation, taxation, or cosmic imbalance. In these moments, memory fragments. Some knowledge is preserved in ritual, some in architecture, some in myth. But without the scaffolding of script, it cannot be recombined easily. The pieces remain, but the instructions are gone. Later civilizations encountering these fragments often misinterpret them. Alignments become decoration, symbols become gods, technical diagrams become sacred art. The past is re-enchanted precisely because it is no longer understood, and yet the fragments are stubborn. They persist in places that resist erasure, in stone, in orientation, in numbers that repeat across cultures with no apparent communication. These remnants suggest that something precise once existed, something systematic enough to leave echoes even after its language died. If writing disappears early, then the collapse of civilization is not simply material, it is epistemic, a break in how reality is understood and transmitted. Once that break occurs, rebuilding complexity becomes exponentially harder. This may explain why civilizations that follow often reach similar levels of sophistication, but by different paths. They rediscover rather than inherit. Progress feels linear only because the resets are invisible, and this leads to a troubling reflection. Our own civilization is more literate than any before it, yet its memory is increasingly externalized, digitized, and centralized. Writing has become code. Archives have become servers. Knowledge persists, but only as long as the systems that support it remain intact. If those systems fracture, what survives? Stories? Fragments? Symbols stripped of context? As the last traces of ancient scripts fade into undeciphered silence, another question emerges quietly from beneath them. If writing is the first thing to disappear, then what follows its disappearance? What other systems collapse once memory itself becomes unstable? Because beyond writing lies something even more fragile: the knowledge of how to read the world itself. When evidence of catastrophe appears in the archaeological record, it rarely arrives as a single dramatic signature. There is no universal layer of ash, no global scar that announces the end of an age with certainty. Instead, the clues are subtle, dispersed, and often dismissed as coincidence. Melted stone in one place, abrupt sediment shifts in another, a sudden cooling recorded in ice far from where cities fell silent. Each piece alone is inconclusive. Together, they form a pattern that resists simple explanation. Earth has always been volatile. Tectonic plates grind without concern for borders. Volcanoes rewrite landscapes overnight. The climate oscillates between extremes that no civilization can negotiate with. This is well understood. What is less comfortable is how often periods of cultural collapse align with moments when the planet itself appears to change tempo. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the climate shifted with startling speed. Temperatures rose, then fell again during a brief but violent return to near-glacial conditions. Sea levels surged, coastlines drowned, entire habitats vanished within generations. Human populations adapted, but not all adaptations were equal. Some ways of living survived the transition, others did not. What is striking is that advanced systems seem particularly vulnerable to these rapid shifts. Infrastructure optimized for stable conditions becomes a liability when stability vanishes. Agricultural calendars fail. Water systems misalign. Predictive models lose accuracy. A society built on precision suddenly finds itself wrong. In several regions, layers of destruction appear that cannot be traced to warfare. High heat exposure without battle debris, structures vitrified without obvious fuel sources. Geological events are often invoked: lightning, wildfires, volcanism. Yet some sites resist these explanations. The temperatures implied exceed what typical surface fires produce. The damage is localized, not regional. Something intense occurred, but not everywhere. Speculation inevitably follows. Cosmic impacts, solar events, atmospheric disturbances. None can be proven definitively, yet none can be dismissed entirely. Earth has experienced near misses before. Ice cores record spikes in radiation. Tree rings show sudden growth suppression consistent with global stress. These are not myths, they are measurements. Still, catastrophe alone does not explain the deeper pattern. Natural disasters destroy indiscriminately. They do not selectively erase systems of knowledge while leaving populations alive. And yet, this is precisely what seems to happen. People endure, cities do not. Complexity collapses inward. One possibility is that the disasters we identify are not the primary cause, but the trigger. A stressor that pushes already fragile systems past their threshold. A final vibration that brings down structures weakened by their own scale. Large civilizations depend on tight coupling, trade networks, specialized labor, long supply chains. When one link fails, pressure propagates. Redundancy is expensive. Efficiency is brittle. Under normal conditions, this is invisible. Under extreme stress, it becomes fatal. In this sense, catastrophe does not end civilizations. It reveals their limits. What unsettles researchers is how often the response to catastrophe is not rebuilding, but simplification. Survivors do not restore what was lost. They adapt by abandoning complexity. This choice suggests memory of failure, a recognition that what came before was not merely destroyed, but flawed. Ancient texts, where they survive, sometimes hint at this recognition. Stories of ages undone by imbalance, by fire, flood or wind sent as correction rather than punishment. These narratives are usually moralized, but beneath the morality lies observation. The world changed, and the way of living before it was no longer viable. If catastrophe were the only factor, we would expect cycles of destruction and reconstruction. Instead, we see resets, new beginnings that deliberately avoid previous peaks. Knowledge advances again, but cautiously, differently. The past becomes something to honor, not repeat. There is also the matter of scale. Many collapses occur without evidence of universal disaster. They are regional, yet synchronized in theme. This suggests that while the Earth may provide the stress, the decisive factor lies within human systems themselves. Catastrophe exposes fragility. It tests assumptions. It asks whether complexity can bend or only break. In many cases, it appears to break. As this pattern repeats, another idea begins to surface, quietly, uncomfortably. That civilizations may not simply be victims of nature, but participants in a feedback loop. That technological and social complexity amplify environmental sensitivity. That progress narrows the margin for error. If this is true, then each advanced civilization carries within it the conditions of its own interruption. Catastrophe does not arrive as an enemy, but as a mirror, and as the geological record continues to reveal moments of abrupt change, cooling, warming, inundation, the question deepens. Were these events unavoidable endings, or warnings that arrived too late? Because if catastrophe is only the spark, then something else must be the fuel, something embedded in how civilizations grow, concentrate, and remember. And that raises a quieter, more disturbing thought. Perhaps the planet does not erase civilizations. Perhaps it merely tests them and watches what they choose to become afterward. Climate does not announce itself as an event. It moves quietly, like a tide that forgets the shape of the shore it once touched. When civilizations fall, climate is often mentioned as background, drought, cold, flood, a supporting actor rather than the central presence. Yet when the timelines are laid over one another, a different picture begins to form. Not a series of accidents, but a rhythm, a pulse that civilizations repeatedly fail to hear until it is already passing through them. The Earth has never been stable in the way human societies assume it to be. Long before cities, before agriculture, before writing, the planet oscillated between extremes. Ice advanced and retreated. Deserts bloomed and vanished. Oceans rose, then withdrew. These movements were slow enough to feel permanent to those living within them, yet fast enough to erase entire ways of life within a few generations. What is unsettling is how often advanced civilizations emerge during periods of climatic calm. Narrow windows where conditions are unusually stable. Rainfall becomes predictable. Seasons align. Rivers behave. Within these windows, complexity flourishes. Agriculture intensifies. Populations concentrate. Long-term planning becomes possible. The future feels reliable, but these windows close. Paleoclimate data shows repeated episodes where stability gives way to volatility. Sudden cooling events, rapid warming phases, shifts in monsoon patterns, changes in ocean circulation. These are not subtle over archaeological timescales. They arrive abruptly, compressing centuries of change into decades. Civilizations built on predictability respond poorly to unpredictability. Farming systems optimized for specific rainfall regimes fail when those regimes shift. Water management infrastructures designed for steady flow break under flood or drought. Trade routes dependent on seasonal winds collapse when those winds change course. What follows is rarely instant collapse. Instead, there is strain, adaptation attempts, overcorrection, expansion into marginal lands, intensification of extraction. The system tightens its grip just as the ground beneath it becomes unstable. This tightening accelerates failure. Climate stress exposes inequalities within societies. Elites insulate themselves. Peripheral regions absorb shock. Resources concentrate. Social cohesion fractures. What was once a shared system becomes contested territory. The climate does not destroy the civilization, it reveals its fault lines. In several ancient cultures, periods of climatic disruption coincide with changes in cosmology. Gods grow angrier, rituals intensify, time becomes cyclical, then apocalyptic. These shifts are often read symbolically, but they may reflect a deeper realization that the world no longer responds as expected. Calendars become unreliable. Agricultural festivals drift out of sync with seasons. Astronomical markers no longer align with weather patterns. When the sky and the land stop agreeing with one another, trust in the order of things erodes. This erosion is not only material, it is existential. Civilizations depend on the belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough to plan. Climate volatility undermines that belief. When unpredictability becomes the norm, long-term institutions lose legitimacy. Immediate survival takes precedence. Complexity becomes a liability. What is striking is how often societies respond not by simplifying early, but by doubling down on control, larger projects, more rigid hierarchies, greater extraction. These responses may stabilize the system briefly, but they increase fragility. When the next disruption arrives, the collapse is sharper. The pattern repeats across continents. The specifics differ, but the structure remains. Climatic stability enables complexity. Complexity amplifies vulnerability. Volatility triggers contraction. Memory fragments, the system resets, and yet, climate alone cannot explain the sameness of the endings. Different regions experience different stresses, yet the outcome converges. This suggests that climate is not the script, it is the pressure. Under pressure, civilizations reveal what they are optimized for. Those optimized for flexibility bend. Those optimized for efficiency snap. There is an uncomfortable implication here. Advanced civilizations tend to optimize for efficiency. Specialization, interdependence, precision. These traits generate prosperity under stable conditions. Under volatility, they accelerate failure. The Earth does not need to be hostile to undo complexity. It only needs to change. In this light, climate cycles are not external threats. They are filters. They test whether a civilization can remain complex without becoming brittle. So far, the record suggests the answer has often been no. As ice cores and sediment layers quietly extend this record into the present, the question becomes less historical and more immediate. Our own era has been defined by an unusually stable climate window. Agriculture expanded, populations surged, systems interconnected globally. That window is shifting. Whether this shift will follow the familiar pattern remains unknown, but the past suggests that when climate rhythms change, civilizations face a choice they rarely recognize in time: adapt by releasing complexity, or attempt to control the uncontrollable. And in that choice lies the beginning of another silence. There is a moment in the life of every complex system when its tools begin to outrun its wisdom. It is rarely announced. More often it arrives disguised as triumph. Efficiency increases, control tightens, the margin for error narrows, but no one notices because the system appears to be working better than ever. In ancient civilizations, this moment often coincides with a subtle shift in priorities. Techniques that once served survival begin to serve expansion. Technologies designed to support communities begin to shape them instead. Irrigation systems demand constant maintenance. Metallurgy requires specialized labor. Astronomical knowledge becomes essential for taxation, ritual, and agriculture. Complexity locks itself in place. At first, this seems like progress. Output increases, surplus grows, cities swell. But beneath the surface, dependence deepens. Fewer people understand how the systems work. Knowledge concentrates. Repair becomes as complex as construction. What was once adaptable becomes rigid. When disruption arrives, whether from climate, conflict, or internal strain, the system cannot simplify gracefully. It either functions fully or not at all. This is where technology stops being neutral. Advanced tools amplify capability, but they also amplify consequences. A simple society can fail slowly. A complex one fails abruptly. When specialized systems break, there is no redundancy. The people who know how to fix them are too few. The materials required are too specific. The chain of support snaps. Archaeological records show this pattern repeatedly. Advanced metallurgy declines into cruder forms. Precision stonework gives way to rough construction. Water systems fall into disrepair and are not rebuilt. The knowledge does not transfer sideways. It collapses inward. It is tempting to interpret this as loss of skill, but skill does not vanish spontaneously. What vanishes is the ecosystem that supports it. Technology does not exist in isolation. It requires training, coordination, trust, and long-term planning. When any of these falter, the technology becomes unusable. Worse, it becomes dangerous. A broken water system spreads disease. A miscalculated calendar starves crops. A failed metallurgical process wastes scarce resources. At this stage, societies often retreat from their most advanced tools, not because they cannot use them, but because they can no longer afford the risk. Simpler methods are slower, but more forgiving. They tolerate error. They survive disruption. There are hints in ancient texts of moments when people deliberately abandoned certain technologies. Not all innovations were embraced indefinitely. Some are associated with imbalance, excess, or collapse. The stories rarely frame this as technological failure. They frame it as moral or cosmic error. But beneath the symbolism lies a recognition that certain tools change the relationship between humans and their environment too drastically. Advanced civilizations often underestimate the cost of maintaining complexity. The cost is not just material, it is cognitive. It requires constant attention, coordination, and belief in the system's future. When belief erodes, maintenance becomes neglect. Neglect accelerates failure. There is also the matter of scale. As technologies scale up, small errors propagate widely. A miscalculation affects entire regions. A failed prediction ripples across trade networks. The system becomes tightly coupled, efficient but fragile. This fragility is invisible until it is tested. When collapse comes, it is not always perceived as collapse. To those living through it, it may feel like relief. Fewer obligations, less surveillance, shorter planning horizons. Life becomes harder in some ways, but simpler in others. The burden of sustaining an immense machine lifts. Later generations interpret this simplification as regression, but for those who experience the strain of overcomplexity, it may have felt like survival. What is unsettling is how often this pattern repeats independently. Different technologies, different cultures, same arc. Innovation accelerates, dependency deepens, flexibility erodes, disruption triggers abandonment. This suggests that the issue is not any specific technology, but the relationship civilizations form with their tools. When tools become indispensable rather than supportive, when systems cannot function without constant optimization, resilience disappears. There is a quiet warning embedded here. Progress is not merely the accumulation of capability, it is the balance between capability and adaptability. Lose that balance and advancement becomes a trap. As ancient civilizations retreated from their highest peaks, they did not return to ignorance, they carried fragments forward, practical skills, stories, rituals, enough to rebuild, but not enough to repeat the same configuration. In this sense, collapse is not the end of intelligence, but the end of a particular arrangement of it. And as this realization settles, another layer of the pattern begins to emerge. Technology does not fail alone. It fails within systems of belief, authority, and control. When those systems shift, memory itself becomes contested. Which raises the next question quietly, almost reluctantly. When civilizations fall and technologies are abandoned, who decides what is remembered and what is allowed to disappear? When civilizations fracture, power rarely disappears with them, it changes shape. Authority withdraws from visible structures and re-emerges in quieter places, in belief, in ritual, in narrative. Long after roads crumble and technologies fall silent, stories remain. And whoever controls those stories controls what the future is allowed to remember. In the aftermath of collapse, memory becomes unstable. Competing explanations circulate. Some remember abundance. Others remember terror. Some blame nature. Others blame human excess. In this confusion, institutions that survive, temples, priesthoods, imperial remnants, later religious orders, begin to stabilize meaning, not necessarily to deceive, but to preserve coherence. Chaos threatens identity. Narrative restores it. This is where history begins to harden. In many post-collapse societies, the past is not preserved as it was, but as it needs to be. Contradictions are smoothed, timelines compressed, achievements attributed to divine intervention rather than human agency. The previous age becomes either mythologized or condemned, rarely examined. This process is not always conscious. Memory decays unevenly. Written records are lost. Oral traditions mutate. Over generations, what remains feels ancient, inevitable, unquestionable. The story becomes sacred not because it is true, but because it stabilizes a fragile present. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that in several regions, later religious or imperial systems deliberately distance themselves from the technical knowledge of earlier civilizations. Astronomy becomes astrology, engineering becomes miracle, mathematics becomes numerology. The transformation is subtle, but decisive. Knowledge that once enabled prediction and control is reinterpreted as symbolic, mystical, or forbidden. This reinterpretation protects society from repeating the same mistakes, but it also prevents understanding them. In some traditions, earlier ages are described as times when humans challenged cosmic order, when they built too high, measured too much, or sought knowledge not meant to be held. These stories often justify collapse as correction. But beneath the moral framing lies an admission. There was something before, and it was powerful enough to frighten those who inherited its ruins. Power prefers manageable memory. As new authorities consolidate, they curate the past. Lineages are rewritten, origins simplified. Complex histories are replaced with founding moments. The deeper timeline, with its rises and erasures, becomes inconvenient. It suggests that the present order is temporary, that what exists now is not the first and will not be the last. Empires in particular struggle with this implication. Their legitimacy rests on continuity and destiny. Acknowledging prior advanced civilizations undermines both. It introduces the possibility of repetition and therefore failure. So the past is flattened. This flattening does not require conspiracy. It emerges naturally from institutional survival. Educational systems teach what is reproducible. Religious systems teach what is stabilizing. Political systems teach what is legitimizing. What does not serve these functions fades. Over time, the result is a historical record that appears confident but shallow. Clean progressions, linear development, occasional setbacks explained neatly. The deeper discontinuities, the resets, are treated as anomalies. Yet traces persist. They appear as architectural oddities that seem out of place in their supposed era, as myths that echo across continents with uncanny similarity, as symbols that recur without clear lineage, as numbers that reappear in sacred texts, measurements and calendars long after their original context is lost. These traces suggest that memory is never fully erased, it is layered. Control over memory does not mean total domination, it means shaping interpretation. A ruined city can be explained as primitive or sacred. A vanished technology can be dismissed as coincidence or elevated as divine. Either way, it is removed from practical continuity. And this removal has consequences. When knowledge is framed as sacred rather than technical, it becomes static. Questioning it becomes heresy. Experimentation ceases. The system stabilizes, but at the cost of adaptability. The civilization that follows becomes safer, but smaller in its ambition. This may be intentional. After collapse, survival often depends on restraint. Yet restraint, sustained too long, becomes stagnation. As centuries pass, the curated narrative hardens into certainty. What was once a protective myth becomes dogma, and dogma resists revision even when new evidence emerges. Ruins are explained away, anomalies ignored. The past becomes a closed book. But history does not remain silent forever. Each generation uncovers fragments the last could not explain. A tool, a text, a structure misaligned with accepted timelines. At first, these discoveries are curiosities, then irritations, then threats. They challenge the simplicity of the story. Institutions respond predictably. The fragments are absorbed, reinterpreted, or marginalized. Rarely are they allowed to reorder the narrative. This is not malice. It is inertia. Yet the cost of inertia is blindness. By refusing to see the true complexity of what came before, civilizations deny themselves a mirror. They lose the opportunity to recognize patterns, to see how others reach similar heights and why they fell. In doing so, they approach the same thresholds with less awareness than those who came before. As this layer settles into place, another tension becomes visible. If memory is curated to protect society from dangerous knowledge, then where does that knowledge go? Is it lost entirely, or does it survive in distorted forms waiting to be misread? Because beyond official history lies another archive, not written, not centralized, but carried in symbols, rituals, and myths that refuse to disappear. And it is there, in those shadowed spaces, that the next trace begins to stir. Civilizations rarely begin on empty ground. They rise on landscapes already shaped by forgotten hands, among stones that have known other names, other meanings. What appears as origin is often occupation. What feels like invention is frequently reuse, and yet this inheritance is usually unrecognized. Across continents, later societies build directly atop the ruins of those that came before. Temples aligned to stars no longer watched, foundations laid with techniques no longer understood, roads that lead nowhere because the destinations have vanished from memory. The new world settles into the old one like a second sleep layered over the first. Archaeology reveals this stacking clearly. Cities layered like sediment. One culture repurposing the walls of another. Floors laid over floors. Sacred spaces reused without comprehension of their original function. What was once precise becomes approximate. What was once systemic becomes symbolic. This reuse is not theft. It is survival. Stone already cut is easier to move than stone yet to be shaped. Water channels already carved are more reliable than digging anew. The past becomes infrastructure, but infrastructure without instruction is dangerous. When a society inherits artifacts it cannot explain, it fills the gap with meaning. Stories grow around the stones. The builders become gods, giants, ancestors, or demons. Construction becomes miracle. Alignment becomes myth. The practical dissolves into the sacred. This transformation protects the artifact from destruction, but it also seals it off from understanding. In many regions, later civilizations maintain sites they did not create with extraordinary care even as their own buildings decay. The older structures are revered, feared, or forbidden. No one repairs them because no one believes they can. They are preserved precisely because they are no longer part of daily life. This is a form of memory that resists analysis. The new civilization thrives within its own framework, unaware that it is surrounded by evidence of another way of living. The ruins are acknowledged but not interrogated. They belong to a different category of reality, outside history, outside replication. Over time, this separation becomes normalized. The past is something to admire, not to learn from. Its lessons are aesthetic or moral, not technical. And yet, beneath this reverence lies a quiet discomfort, the sense that something important has been lost, that the present is smaller than what once was possible. This discomfort surfaces in myths of golden ages, of ancestors who lived longer, built better, knew more. The direction of progress subtly reverses. The future is no longer imagined as improvement, but as recovery. What makes this pattern unsettling is how consistently it appears. Civilizations that follow do not surpass the previous peaks immediately. They circle them, they reinterpret them, they approach complexity cautiously, as if remembering failure without knowing why. This caution may be inherited trauma. Living among ruins imposes psychological limits. It suggests that collapse is possible, that greatness is temporary, that systems can fail catastrophically. Even without understanding the mechanism, the presence of ruins teaches restraint. Yet restraint has a cost. It slows experimentation. It discourages ambitious integration of systems. It favors stability over exploration. Over generations, this produces societies that are resilient but constrained. They endure, but they do not reach the same heights. When they eventually do, they do so differently, often rediscovering principles rather than continuing traditions. This rediscovery feels like progress, but it is laced with amnesia. The danger lies not in forgetting entirely, but in forgetting selectively. The visible achievements are remembered, the invisible failures are not. Without understanding why earlier systems collapsed, later ones repeat structural vulnerabilities under new forms. Thus, the cycle tightens. Building atop ruins also creates false confidence. The land appears supportive, the foundations feel solid. But they were designed for systems that no longer exist. When new stress arrives, the inherited structures respond unpredictably. There is a metaphor here that civilizations rarely recognize until too late. A society that does not know why something was built cannot know when it will fail. As modern observers uncover these layers, the temptation is to romanticize the past, to imagine lost wisdom waiting to be recovered intact. But the reality is harsher. What remains are fragments. Without context, fragments mislead as easily as they inspire. And this is perhaps the most dangerous inheritance of all. The belief that the past can be copied without understanding. That progress is a matter of imitation rather than integration. Civilizations that unknowingly build atop ruins inherit not just stone, but unfinished questions. They walk streets aligned to forgotten skies. They govern populations atop systems calibrated to climates that no longer exist. They measure time using calendars disconnected from original observation. Everything appears functional, until it doesn't. As the pattern becomes clearer, another layer presses forward. If civilizations repeatedly build atop the remains of others without understanding them, then perhaps collapse is not a failure of intelligence, but of transmission. Knowledge does not vanish because it is weak. It vanishes because it cannot survive being stripped of context. And if that is true, then the real danger is not forgetting the past entirely, but misunderstanding it so completely that its warnings are rendered invisible. Which leads to a quieter, more troubling thought. What if our own foundations rest on assumptions we no longer recognize as inherited? What if the systems we trust were never designed for the pressures now gathering around them? Because if we are living atop ruins without knowing it, then the silence that followed previous civilizations may not be as distant as it feels. When memory can no longer be carried by institutions, it retreats into symbols. Not because symbols are clearer, but because they are resilient. They survive translation. They endure collapse. They slip past senses and centuries alike, carrying fragments of meaning that can no longer be spoken directly. Across civilizations that never met, the same images recur. A great flood that resets the world. A tower or mountain that once connected heaven and earth. A time before time, when knowledge was closer, when the sky was understood differently. These similarities are often explained as coincidence or shared psychology. But coincidence becomes less convincing when repetition spans continents and millennia. Symbols compress complexity. They turn processes into stories. They encode warnings in narrative form. When the technical language of a civilization disappears, symbols become the last containers capable of holding its memory. Consider how often ancient myths describe cycles rather than lines. Ages rise and fall, worlds are created and destroyed. Humanity is renewed after catastrophe. These are not stories of progress. They are stories of recurrence. They suggest an awareness that collapse is not exceptional. It is structural. What is striking is how these myths rarely celebrate the fall itself. They mourn it. They speak of loss, of knowledge withdrawn, of harmony broken. The gods depart. The golden age ends. Something precious becomes inaccessible. This tone matters. It suggests that those who carried these stories did not see collapse as triumph or punishment alone, but as consequence, a result of imbalance, excess, or forgetting. The lesson is not moral in a narrow sense. It is systemic. Symbols also preserve numbers, ratios, alignments, repetitions that appear too consistent to be decorative. Certain measurements recur in sacred architecture across cultures. Certain time cycles repeat in myth and ritual. Without context, these patterns seem mystical. With context, they hint at observational knowledge of the sky, the earth, or both. When writing disappears, these patterns become the only way to transmit precision. They are disguised as sacred geometry, divine proportion, cosmic order. The language shifts, but the structure remains. Yet symbols are double-edged. They protect knowledge from erasure, but they also invite reinterpretation. Each generation projects its own meaning onto them. Over time, the original reference fades, replaced by metaphor. This is how memory survives and mutates. Later civilizations inherit these symbols without knowing what they once measured or warned against. The flood becomes moral cleansing rather than climate trauma. The fall of the tower becomes pride rather than over-centralization. The cycle of ages becomes destiny rather than pattern. And so, the warning is softened. What remains is atmosphere rather than instruction. Awe rather than analysis. Reverence rather than understanding. This process is not failure. It is adaptation. Symbols are what memory becomes when clarity is too dangerous or too fragile to maintain. They allow civilizations to remember that something happened, even when they cannot remember exactly what. But this incomplete memory carries risk. Symbols without context can be activated incorrectly. They can inspire repetition rather than avoidance. A myth of lost greatness can motivate rebuilding without understanding why greatness was lost. The symbol calls forward the form, but not the caution. This is how cycles continue. As civilizations rediscover complexity, they often do so under the guidance of symbolic memory rather than technical inheritance. They rebuild towers, they map skies, they measure time. But the underlying constraints that once shaped those systems are forgotten. In this way, symbols become both guardians and traps. They preserve the idea of advanced knowledge while obscuring its conditions of failure. There is a subtle melancholy embedded in ancient myth, a sense that something was once known directly and is now remembered only through story, that humans are repeating gestures whose original meaning has slipped away. This melancholy is not accidental. It is the emotional residue of loss transmitted across generations. Even when details vanish, the feeling remains, the intuition that the past holds lessons we're no longer able to read. As archaeology uncovers more evidence of abrupt transitions and forgotten sophistication, the symbolic record begins to align with the material one. The myths no longer look purely fantastical. They look like echoes of observation filtered through collapse. Yet echoes are distorted. They cannot tell us precisely what failed, only that something did. This raises an uncomfortable possibility, that the civilizations which collapsed before us tried to warn the future, but lacked the means to speak clearly across the rupture. Symbols were the best they could do. If that is true, then the question becomes urgent. Are we listening to these symbols as warnings or as invitations? Because symbols do not command, they suggest. They open doors without forcing us through them. Interpretation is always optional. As our own civilization reaches a level of complexity unmatched in history, we are surrounded by symbols of past collapse that we admire but rarely interrogate. We visit ruins, we read myths, we marvel at alignments. Yet we seldom ask what conditions made them necessary or impossible to sustain. The silence that followed earlier civilizations was not total. It whispered through symbols, through stories, through the uneasy sense that history moves in circles wider than our timelines admit. And if symbols are what remains when instruction is gone, then perhaps the most important knowledge is not hidden, but misread. Which leads to the next layer of the pattern. If memory survives in symbols and myths, then somewhere there must be attempts to decode them, attempts that are resisted, dismissed, or marginalized. because understanding the symbols fully would require confronting what they imply about the future, not just the past. There comes a moment when a civilization decides that its history is complete enough, not finished, but settled. The rough edges are filed down. The unanswered questions are labelled mysteries rather than problems. From that point on, new discoveries are expected to fit the frame, not reshape it. This is when history becomes comfortable. The past, once turbulent and uncertain, is reorganized into a clean progression. Early beginnings, gradual improvement, occasional setbacks, ultimate arrival at the present. The narrative is not false in its details, but selective in its structure. What does not fit the arc is treated as noise. This process is subtle. It rarely announces itself as censorship. Instead, it operates through preference. Certain explanations are easier to teach, certain timelines are easier to defend, certain questions are easier to stop asking. Archaeology, when practiced carefully, reveals complexity. But when filtered through institutions, that complexity is often softened. Anomalies become outliers. Outliers become footnotes. Footnotes become silence. The result is a history that feels coherent but incomplete. What is lost in this smoothing is not just data, but possibility. The possibility that progress is not linear, that collapse is not accidental, that entire chapters may be missing, not because evidence is absent, but because it destabilizes the story we rely on. Civilizations prefer stories that reassure. Stories that suggest the present is the most advanced point so far. Stories that imply mistakes have been corrected rather than repeated. Acknowledging previous advanced civilizations complicates this comfort. It introduces humility. And humility is not always compatible with power. This is why periods of profound regression are often compressed into vague terms. Dark Age, Interregnum, Transitional Phase. Language that acknowledges absence without exploring its cause. Thousands of years are condensed into a sentence. The silence is preserved but unexplored. Yet silence itself is evidence. When a culture forgets how to build something it once built well, that is not a minor detail. It is a structural failure of transmission. When writing vanishes entirely, that is not natural decay. It is interruption. When population continuity exists but technological continuity does not, something has broken at the level of systems. These are not mysteries to be admired. They are warnings to be studied. But warnings challenge confidence, and confidence underwrites authority. As history becomes institutionalized, its function shifts. It no longer exists primarily to understand the past, but to justify the present. Educational systems teach what leads to stable identity. National narratives emphasize origin and destiny. Religious narratives emphasize meaning and order. None of these are inherently deceptive, but they are inherently selective. What falls outside their needs becomes marginal. Researchers who probe too deeply into discontinuity often encounter resistance that is social rather than evidential. Funding dries up. Interest wanes, careers drift, not because the questions are invalid, but because they are uncomfortable. They imply that civilization is not a culmination, but a phase, and phases end. The discomfort intensifies when parallels emerge between past and present. When the same markers appear again, concentration of knowledge, dependence on fragile systems, climate instability, loss of long-term thinking, narrative control. The pattern becomes difficult to ignore. At this stage, history's neatness becomes dangerous. A civilization that believes collapse only happens to others will not recognize its own symptoms. A society that sees itself as unprecedented will not see repetition. A culture convinced of linear progress will interpret warning signs as temporary setbacks. This is how certainty dulls perception. There is also the issue of scale. Modern civilizations operate on global integration. Supply chains span continents. information moves instantly. Systems are optimized to an extraordinary degree. This creates an illusion of control, but it also amplifies fragility. Small disruptions propagate rapidly. Local failures become systemic. History that emphasizes resilience over fragility prepares societies poorly for this reality. What is striking is how often past civilizations appear to have sensed this danger intuitively. Myths warn against hubris. Stories caution against imbalance. Symbols encode cycles. These are not naive fears. They are pattern recognition expressed in narrative form. But when history is taught as triumph rather than pattern, these warnings are neutralized. They become entertainment, allegory, background noise. The question is not whether history has been simplified. All history is. The question is whether simplification has crossed into denial. Denial is not ignorance. It is refusal to integrate inconvenient knowledge. As new data emerges from climate science, archaeology, systems theory, the old narrative strains, the edges fray, the gaps widen. At some point, the effort required to maintain the simplified story exceeds the effort required to revise it. Civilizations rarely choose revision willingly. More often, revision is forced by events. This is where the present moment becomes uneasy, because the same pressures that preceded earlier collapses are visible again, not identically, but structurally. Complexity, interdependence, environmental stress, narrative rigidity. History flattened into reassurance becomes less useful precisely when it is most needed. If the past were allowed to be truly discontinuous, it might teach humility. It might encourage adaptability. It might normalize simplification as a strategic response rather than a failure. Instead, we inherit a story that leaves no room for stepping down gracefully. And so, the question shifts again. If history has been made neat to protect stability, then what happens when stability itself begins to fracture? Where do societies turn when their official memory no longer explains their experience? Because beyond institutional history lies another record, one that becomes visible only when systems begin to fail. What we call a dark age is rarely dark to those who live within it. The darkness belongs to the records, not the days. It is a shadow cast backward by historians who search for continuity and find only gaps. But gaps do not mean emptiness. They mean quiet, and quiet in human history is often intentional. After collapse, when institutions dissolve and systems retract, societies do not simply wander blindly. They reorganize inward. They shorten their horizons. They choose survival over spectacle. What disappears from view is not life, but documentation. Not activity, but ambition. The term dark age reveals more about expectation than reality. It assumes that progress must be visible, measurable, cumulative. When those signals fade, absence is inferred. Yet in many regions, the archaeological record shows continuity of habitation, adaptation of agriculture, and the persistence of craft, just not at the scale or complexity that previous systems demanded. This reduction is often interpreted as failure, but failure implies intent. What if it was choice? Complex societies require constant coordination. They pull energy from the future to stabilize the present. When that pull becomes unsustainable, contraction can be rational. Smaller communities are more flexible. Oral knowledge travels faster than written bureaucracy. Local systems adapt more quickly than centralized ones. The trade-off is reach. The gain is resilience. In such periods, knowledge does not vanish. It changes form. Techniques become embodied rather than recorded. Skills are taught through practice rather than text. Memory lives in rhythm, ritual, and repetition. From the outside, this looks like stagnation. From within, it feels like balance. Dark ages are often marked by the decline of monumental construction. No great temples, no vast cities, no ambitious infrastructure. This is taken as evidence of incapacity. but monuments are statements of surplus. When surplus becomes dangerous, restraint replaces display. There is a humility to these periods that later ages struggle to recognize, a willingness to live smaller, to accept limits, to release the burden of maintaining complexity that no longer fits the world as it is. What makes these eras difficult to study is precisely what made them survivable. They leave fewer traces, less stone, fewer inscriptions, fewer artifacts designed to last. They invest in the present rather than the archive, and yet the influence of these quiet centuries is profound. They transmit genetic memory, local adaptation, and cultural continuity across the rupture. Without them, later revivals would have nothing to build upon. This reframes the notion of recovery. Instead of collapse followed by rebirth, the pattern may be collapse followed by incubation, a period where civilization rests, recalibrates, and sheds excess before complexity returns. If this is true, then dark ages are not interruptions in history, they are phases of it. This perspective also explains why knowledge re-emerges differently. When complexity returns, it does not pick up where it left off. It approaches from another angle. It reinvents rather than restores. The old configuration is remembered only dimly, often as myth or warning. This is why later civilizations often rediscover techniques independently, rather than inheriting them directly. The continuity that would allow direct transfer was intentionally loosened. Not everything was meant to survive intact. The danger lies in misunderstanding this process. When dark ages are framed solely as loss, the lesson drawn is acceleration. The impulse becomes to preserve everything, to prevent any reduction, to cling to complexity at all costs. But history suggests that reduction is sometimes the price of endurance. Civilizations that refuse to contract when conditions demand it do not become more resilient. They become brittle. They stretch systems beyond their capacity to adapt. When failure comes, it is catastrophic rather than controlled. In this light, the silence of dark ages becomes meaningful. It is not ignorance, but pause, not decay, but recalibration. This silence is uncomfortable for civilizations that define themselves by expansion. It contradicts the belief that growth is synonymous with progress. It implies that wisdom may sometimes require retreat. As modern observers, we struggle with this implication. Our systems are optimized for scale. Our identities are tied to momentum. A deliberate step back feels like defeat. But the past whispers a different lesson. That endurance may depend on knowing when not to advance, when to stop building, when to let systems fall quiet before they shatter. The challenge is that such wisdom is rarely celebrated. It leaves no monuments, no triumphant narratives. It survives only as absence, a missing chapter between peaks, and absence is easy to misread. As we move closer to the present, the intervals between peaks appear to shorten. Complexity returns faster. Systems rebuild with greater reach, but the quiet phases grow more difficult to tolerate. There is less patience for pause, less acceptance of reduction. This raises a question that the record does not answer directly: whether the shortening of these cycles reflects learning or loss of restraint. If dark ages were once a buffer that allowed civilization to survive its own excess, what happens when that buffer is no longer available? When contraction is resisted until collapse becomes unavoidable? The past suggests that silence has a function. It absorbs shock. It allows memory to reorganize. It prevents repetition by slowing momentum. Ignoring that function may be one of the most subtle risks of all. As the so-called dark ages recede into reinterpretation, they reveal themselves not as voids, but as thresholds. Places where civilizations chose to endure quietly rather than fail loudly. And that realization presses forward into the next uncertainty. If quiet survival is part of the pattern, then who carries the memory through those silences? Who becomes the witness when institutions fall away? Because in every age of contraction, There are those who remember not as rulers or chroniclers, but as keepers of fragments that will matter later. When institutions dissolve and archives fall silent, memory does not vanish evenly. It pools, it clings to margins, it survives where attention is least focused, in lineages, in practices repeated without explanation, in stories told not to teach history but to make sense of the present. These are not the memories of empires, they are the memories of witnesses. Every period of contraction leaves behind people who carry fragments forward. Farmers who remember when seasons changed abruptly, artisans who retain techniques no longer fashionable, storytellers who preserve sequences of events disguised as parable. Their knowledge is partial, embodied, and often dismissed. Yet without them, continuity would fail entirely. These witnesses rarely see themselves as custodians of the past. They are simply doing what works, planting when the soil responds, aligning structures by inherited rule, singing stories that feel old even to those who sing them. Over generations, intention fades, but repetition remains. This is how memory survives when clarity would be dangerous. In many cultures, certain families or groups are associated with particular skills long after the reason for those skills is forgotten. Metalworking traditions persist in isolated regions. Navigation knowledge survives among coastal communities without written charts. Astronomical awareness lingers in ritual calendars even after formal observatories collapse. These survivals are uneven, fragile, and often misunderstood. What matters is not their completeness, but their persistence. Witnesses do not preserve systems, they preserve affordances, ways of interacting with the world that remain valid even when the explanation is gone, a method of building that resists earthquakes, a planting cycle that tolerates drought, a navigational practice that reads stars without instruments. This kind of knowledge does not announce itself as advanced. It blends in. It looks ordinary. That is why it survives. Formal knowledge, by contrast, requires support. It needs institutions, consensus, validation. When those vanish, formal knowledge collapses quickly. Informal knowledge adapts. There is an irony here that history rarely acknowledges. The people most likely to carry crucial fragments through collapse are not the celebrated thinkers, but the practitioners, not the chroniclers, but the doers. Their contributions are invisible to grand narratives precisely because they leave few monuments, and yet later revivals depend on them. When complexity begins to return, it does not emerge from ruins alone. It emerges from continuity at the edges, from techniques refined quietly across generations, from habits that endured because they worked under constraint. This is why periods following collapse often see sudden bursts of rediscovery. Knowledge seems to reappear as if from nowhere, but it is not nowhere. It is from people who never forgot, only never wrote. There is also a tension in this form of memory. It resists abstraction. It cannot easily scale. It is local, situational, responsive. This makes it resilient but difficult to integrate into large systems. When civilizations rebuild, they often extract these practices without honouring their context. They codify what was once flexible. They formalize what was once adaptive. In doing so, they gain reach and lose resilience. Witness memory also carries emotion, not just information, but feeling. Fear associated with certain behaviours, reverence tied to specific places, aversion to particular forms of concentration or excess. These emotions are often encoded as taboo or superstition. Later ages mock them, yet taboos often function as compressed warnings. Do not build there, do not gather too much, do not disturb that alignment. The reasons may be forgotten, but the instruction persists. When these instructions are ignored, consequences follow, and the old stories gain new relevance. The presence of witnesses complicates the idea of total erasure. Civilizations do not forget everything at once. They forget unevenly. They remember sideways. They carry forward what can be lived, not what can be explained. This has implications for how collapse unfolds. It is not a clean break, it is a gradient. Some knowledge dies quickly, some lingers stubbornly, some resurfaces later, transformed. And this transformation is key. What witnesses carry forward is not pristine truth. It is survival-shaped truth, trimmed, biased, sometimes wrong, but oriented toward endurance. Later civilizations, hungry for mastery, often mistake this knowledge for incomplete science rather than adapted wisdom. They attempt to optimize it, to improve it, to scale it. In doing so, they remove the very features that allowed it to persist through instability. Thus, the cycle tightens again. There is also a quieter role that witnesses play. They humanize collapse. Grand narratives frame collapse as abstract process, climate, systems, thresholds. Witness memory reminds us that collapse is lived, that people adjust their lives in response to pressures long before institutions respond. This lived adjustment is rarely recorded, yet it determines survival. It shapes the next phase. It decides which fragments cross the gap. In this sense, witnesses are bridges, not between past and present as history imagines it, but between conditions. They translate experience into habit. They carry forward not answers, but ways of responding. As our own civilization becomes more abstract, more centralized, more dependent on systems few understand, the distance between formal knowledge and lived practice widens. This distance is comfortable until it isn't. When disruption arrives, witnesses emerge again. Those who know how to function without optimization, who remember alternatives not because they studied them, but because they lived them. The pattern suggests that collapse is never complete because memory never is. It is redistributed, concentrated where it can survive, diluted where it cannot. This reframes the role of the individual in history, not as hero or innovator, but as carrier, someone who preserves a fragment that will matter later, even if they never know why. And this brings the question closer to the present. If witnesses always exist, then who are they now? What knowledge is being carried quietly, unrecognized, outside the systems we trust most? Because when the next silence arrives, and history suggests it always does, it will not be archives or databases that decide what comes after. It will be what people can remember how to do without them. And that is a form of knowledge our narratives rarely prepare us to value. Every civilization believes its intelligence will save it. That knowledge, once accumulated to a sufficient degree, will override the forces that ended others. This belief is not arrogance so much as habit. It grows naturally from success. When systems work, confidence follows. When confidence deepens, caution thins. What history suggests quietly and persistently is that intelligence alone has never been enough. Advanced civilizations tend to share a particular illusion. The complexity is a shield. That layered systems, specialization and abstraction create safety. In reality, they create dependency. Each layer relies on the stability of the one beneath it. Each optimization trades adaptability for efficiency. The system grows powerful but narrow. This narrowing is difficult to perceive from within. Specialization feels like mastery. Interdependence feels like strength. Redundancy feels wasteful. The civilization becomes very good at doing what it does, and very bad at doing anything else. When disruption arrives, the system does not bend. It fractures along its points of specialization. This is not a moral failing. It is a structural one. As civilizations advance, they externalize more and more of their intelligence. Knowledge moves from bodies into tools, from tools into systems, from systems into abstractions few can interpret directly. This allows unprecedented scale. It also creates a gap between understanding and operation. Most people no longer know how the world they depend on actually works. They know how to use it, not how to repair it. They trust interfaces, not processes. When those interfaces fail, The knowledge required to respond is concentrated in too few hands. This concentration feels efficient until it becomes catastrophic. History shows that civilizations often collapse not because they lack intelligence, but because their intelligence is arranged in ways that cannot survive stress. The smarter the system, the more brittle it becomes when its assumptions are violated. There is a tragic symmetry here. The very innovations that enable civilizations to transcend limits also bind them to those limits. The more precisely a society tunes itself to a particular environment, the less tolerant it becomes of change. This is why advanced civilizations so often fail in similar ways. Not because they copy one another, but because complexity converges on the same vulnerabilities. At a certain point, intelligence becomes self-referential. It optimizes systems to sustain the systems themselves. Growth feeds growth. Abstraction feeds abstraction. The original purpose, human well-being, adaptability, continuity, fades into background metrics. Warnings arise, but they are filtered through the same structures that created the risk. Models reassure, projections adjust, narratives emphasize control. The system interprets uncertainty as something to be managed rather than something to be respected. This is where civilizations lose their margin. The past offers numerous examples of societies that recognized danger but could not alter course. They saw the signs: resource strain, social fragmentation, environmental stress, yet continued forward because the cost of change seemed higher than the cost of continuation. By the time reversal became unavoidable, it was no longer possible. Intelligence in these moments does not fail to understand the problem. It fails to act outside the framework that created it. This is why collapse often feels sudden in retrospect. Not because it happened quickly, but because adaptation lagged behind recognition. The system knew. It simply could not change itself fast enough. There is a quiet lesson embedded here that modern narratives resist. That intelligence does not guarantee wisdom. That knowledge does not ensure restraint. That understanding patterns does not automatically free a civilization from repeating them. Wisdom requires something intelligence alone cannot supply. The willingness to relinquish advantage, to simplify deliberately, to accept limits before they are imposed. History suggests that civilizations rarely do this willingly. Simplification feels like loss, reduction feels like failure, yet enforced reduction is far more destructive than chosen restraint. This pattern casts a different light on collapse. It is not punishment, it is correction. Not imposed by nature or fate, but by the structure of complexity itself. When intelligence outruns adaptability, the system selects for reduction. This selection is not conscious, it is systemic. Complexity that cannot survive stress is removed. What remains is what can function under constraint. Seen this way, collapse is not the opposite of progress, it is part of its ecology. The unsettling implication is that advanced civilizations do not disappear because they lack solutions. They disappear because they cannot accept the solutions that require giving something up. This creates a paradox. The more capable a civilization becomes, the harder it is for it to step down gracefully. Its achievements trap it in a narrow range of options. It can either continue or break. Earlier civilizations may have sensed this intuitively. Their myths warn against excess, not because excess is immoral, but because it narrows possibility. Their stories caution against reaching too far, not because reaching is wrong, but because it demands structures that cannot retreat. In modern terms, this is the problem of lock-in. Systems become so optimized that deviation becomes impossible. Innovation continues, but only in directions that reinforce existing frameworks. When the environment shifts beyond those frameworks, innovation becomes irrelevant. The question, then, is not whether advanced civilizations are intelligent enough to survive, it is whether they are flexible enough to let go. History's answer has been consistent. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means it is probable under certain configurations of intelligence and power. configurations that favour growth over balance, efficiency over resilience, control over humility. As our own civilization pushes deeper into abstraction, automation, and optimization, the pattern grows uncomfortably familiar. Intelligence accelerates, complexity deepens, dependence tightens, the margin thins. The danger is not that we do not know this. The danger is that knowing it does not automatically grant the capacity to change. Because awareness does not dissolve structure, it must be acted upon, and action requires sacrifice. Which brings the pattern toward its most intimate layer. If civilizations fall not because they are ignorant, but because they cannot relinquish what they have built, then the final question is not historical at all. It is personal. What would it mean, collectively, to choose less before being forced into nothing? The present always feels unique to those living inside it. Every generation senses that it stands at an edge no one before has reached. The tools are new, the speed is new, the scale is new. And yet, when viewed through the long lens of history, the emotional texture of this moment feels familiar. A quiet tension, a background hum of acceleration. A sense that systems are working, right up until they aren't. Advanced civilizations rarely recognize themselves as advanced in the way history will later describe them. They experience their sophistication as normal. Infrastructure becomes invisible. Complexity feels natural. Dependency hides behind convenience. The extraordinary becomes routine. This normalization is dangerous. When everything works, fragility is masked. Interdependence looks like cooperation. Abstraction looks like mastery. Control feels permanent. It is only when something small breaks, a supply line, a signal, a trust, that the scale of dependence becomes visible. History shows that civilizations often reach their peak not at the height of stability, but at the height of confidence. When the future is assumed rather than questioned. When caution is dismissed as pessimism. When restraint is framed as opposition to progress. In these moments, warning signs are not absent. They are present, but reinterpreted. Stress becomes opportunity. Disruption becomes innovation. Risk becomes acceptable collateral. The system reframes danger as something to be managed rather than something to be avoided. This reframing is subtle. It does not announce collapse. It celebrates resilience. It praises adaptation without examining cost. It assumes that every problem can be solved within the existing structure. But structures have limits. The past suggests that civilizations often sense these limits before they cross them. There are periods of anxiety, of cultural unease, of prophetic language, of nostalgia for imagined simplicity. Art grows darker, stories grow apocalyptic, philosophies turn inward. These are not signs of weakness, they are signs of recognition. Something feels wrong. Yet recognition alone does not change trajectory. It must be translated into collective action, and collective action requires shared belief. When belief fragments, action stalls. Modern civilizations are particularly vulnerable here. Their scale makes consensus difficult. Their diversity of experience dilutes urgency. Their success makes radical change feel unnecessary until it becomes unavoidable. This creates a lag between awareness and response. Earlier civilizations experienced this lag as well. They saw rivers change course, seasons drift, social bonds strain. But their tools for response were limited by the same systems that created the strain. Large institutions move slowly. Specialized systems resist simplification. Power structures protect continuity over transformation. The result is a familiar rhythm. The world shifts. The civilization compensates. Compensation increases strain. Strain reveals fragility. Fragility demands control. Control accelerates collapse. What makes the present moment unsettling is not that this pattern exists, but that it is now global. There is no periphery to absorb shock, no untouched region to migrate into, no external system to inherit stability from. This is unprecedented in scale, but not in structure. Civilizations in the past also believed they had no alternative, that their systems were too integrated to unwind. That simplification would be catastrophic. That collapse could only come from outside. They were wrong. Collapse came from within, triggered by pressures they recognized but could not escape. This recognition often appears late, framed as crisis rather than pattern. By then, choices are constrained, options narrow, trade-offs become stark. The tragedy is not ignorance, it is delay. History suggests that the most dangerous moment for a civilization is not when it is weak, but when it is strong enough to believe it can absorb any shock. Strength becomes inertia. Inertia becomes vulnerability. There is a strange intimacy to this realization. It brings collapse out of abstraction and into lived experience. The pattern is no longer something that happened to others. It becomes something that could be happening now, quietly, unevenly, without drama. Not with fire or invasion, but with maintenance failures, with trust erosion, with slow loss of shared reality, with systems that technically function, but no longer serve. This is how civilizations drift toward their thresholds, not by choosing destruction, but by postponing transformation. The past also shows that once a civilization crosses certain thresholds, recovery becomes impossible within the same configuration. Too much complexity, too much dependence, too little slack. The system cannot simplify without breaking. At that point, collapse is no longer a choice. It is a process. What remains uncertain is whether recognition can arrive early enough to change the arc. Whether a civilization can learn to step down deliberately, to release complexity without losing coherence, to value resilience over reach. History offers few clear examples of this, not because it never happened, but because such transitions leave little record. They do not produce monuments. They do not inspire epics. They look like decline to those who measure success by scale. Yet those transitions may be the most successful of all. As we stand within our own moment of acceleration, the question is not whether we resemble past civilizations. The similarities are evident. The question is whether we can respond differently. And this is where the pattern becomes most uncomfortable. Because responding differently would require redefining success, letting go of narratives that equate growth with survival, accepting limits not as failure, but as wisdom. This is not a technical challenge, it is a cultural one. Civilizations fall in similar ways not because they lack knowledge, but because they share assumptions. Assumptions about progress, control, and permanence. Assumptions that feel invisible until they are challenged. The present moment is heavy with such challenges. Environmental shifts, social fragmentation, technological acceleration, narrative instability. Each on its own feels manageable. Together they form a pressure that history recognizes. Pressure reveals structure. As this realization settles, the pattern reaches its quietest point. Not a climax, but a pause. A moment of reflection that previous civilizations may also have felt. Standing amid their own achievements, sensing unease without fully naming it. What matters now is not prediction, but attention. Not certainty, but humility. Not mastery, but awareness of limits. Because the past does not warn loudly, it whispers, and it whispers the same message each time. The question is whether we are listening, or simply hearing echoes of ourselves. In the end, civilizations do not disappear all at once. They thin, they fade at the edges first, where maintenance becomes optional and meaning begins to loosen. What remains visible for a long time is not collapse, but routine. People continue to work, to plan, to argue, to dream. The world still feels inhabited, and that is why endings are so difficult to recognize while they are happening. History rarely records the final moment accurately. It looks back and assigns dates, causes, names. But for those inside the process, there is no single ending. There is only a series of small relinquishments, a bridge not repaired, a practice no longer taught, a system trusted a little less than before. These moments do not feel dramatic, they feel reasonable. Civilizations end not with screams, but with adjustments, with decisions made under pressure that seem temporary at the time, with compromises justified as necessary, with complexity reduced just enough to keep functioning, until reduction becomes the only remaining option. What makes the pattern so persistent is that it is not driven by failure alone but by success. Systems that work well resist change, institutions that endure defend their own logic, narratives that unify protect themselves from contradiction. The civilization becomes excellent at sustaining itself, right up until the conditions that made that excellence possible begin to shift. And when they do, the system responds in familiar ways. It optimizes, it accelerates, it tightens control, it trusts that refinement will solve what adaptation cannot. This response feels intelligent. It often is. But intelligence directed inward cannot compensate for a world moving outward. Eventually, the effort required to maintain the system exceeds the energy it provides. This is not always visible in collapse metrics. It appears first in fatigue, in loss of faith, in a quiet sense that the future is no longer expanding but narrowing. At that point, civilizations do not choose their endings. They choose how long to postpone them. The past suggests that postponement carries a cost. The longer simplification is delayed, the harsher it becomes when it finally arrives. Controlled contraction gives way to uncontrolled fracture. What could have been a descent becomes a fall. Yet even then, nothing truly ends. People adapt. Memory redistributes. Knowledge survives in fragments. Life continues, quieter, smaller, closer to the ground. The world does not reset completely. It reconfigures. This is perhaps the most important lesson the long record offers. Collapse is not annihilation. It is transformation under constraint. What disappears is a particular arrangement of complexity, not humanity, not intelligence, not curiosity. What follows is not darkness, but silence. A pause long enough for new patterns to form. Seen this way, the question shifts. Not whether advanced civilizations disappear, but whether they can accept the forms of survival that do not resemble success. History suggests that civilizations struggle most with humility, with the idea that stepping back can be wiser than pushing forward, that limits can be embraced rather than conquered, that endurance may require becoming smaller before becoming whole again. These are not conclusions history presents clearly. They are implications we draw by listening to what repeats. The ruins scattered across the planet do not accuse. They do not warn directly. They wait. They allow each generation to project its own meaning onto them. For some, they inspire conquest. For others, reverence. For a few, reflection. Reflection is the rarest response. To reflect is to accept that the present is not final, that the systems we depend on are provisional, that our narratives are partial, that the silence after previous civilizations is not proof of their inferiority, but evidence of their humanity. They were not ignorant, they were not foolish, they were not uniquely flawed. They were us, under different skies, making choices that felt necessary at the time, and that recognition is unsettling, because it dissolves distance. It brings the pattern close enough to touch. It suggests that the forces shaping our future are not external enemies or sudden catastrophes, but familiar habits, the way we define progress, the way we respond to discomfort, the way we postpone difficult change in favour of immediate continuity. The long arc of history does not condemn. It invites attention. If advanced civilizations disappear in similar ways, it is not because they share a fate imposed from outside. It is because they share assumptions carried quietly across time. Assumptions about growth, control, and permanence that feel natural until they are tested. What happens when those assumptions loosen is not predetermined. There is no single ending waiting, only branching possibilities shaped by choices made under pressure. and pressure is rising. Not dramatically, not uniformly, but persistently. In climate, in systems, in trust, in meaning. The signals are not hidden. They are familiar. The difference now is not awareness, it is scale. Never before has a civilization been so interconnected, so abstract, so confident in its capacity to manage complexity. Never before has the margin for error been so thin. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means the pattern is active. History does not repeat mechanically. It echoes. Each echo is altered by context, by choice, by memory. Whether the echo becomes a repetition depends on what is done with that memory. The past leaves us with no instructions, only reflections. It does not tell us what will happen. It shows us what has happened before, under similar tensions, and then it falls silent. That silence is not an ending. It is a space, a moment where the story has not yet chosen its next shape. What fills that space is not history's decision. It is ours. And somewhere in the future, long after our own routines feel as distant as ruins do now, someone may stand among the remnants of this age and wonder the same quiet question we ask of those before us. Not how it ended, but whether it could have ended differently.